Yo, this hot, this the spot, there it is, pod.com. We're interviewing the best comedians, so tune in quick and get your ears receiving them. We talking about life and life to stream right to you, from the microphone right to your home, dude. Side note, this might get embarrassing, but no, don't sweat, yo, cause there it is.
Welcome to the There It Is podcast, a comedy podcast to help you find your inspiration. I'm your host, Jason Farr. Let's do this. Thanks so much for being here. Great guest today. It's LA comedian and writer Rebecca Rush. Excited to have her. First, though, I have a couple things to mention. A while back, late 2019, I shot something that is now out. It's on Disney Plus. It's a kids game show called The Big Fib, and it's hosted by Yvette Nicole Brown, who is amazing. She's an amazing person. She's been in a ton of stuff. You've seen her, maybe most notably as Shirley from Community.
Happy birthday, Jesus.
And it was great meeting her in person, and it was a fun little thing. It's a kid show. If you have kids, check it out. I'm in episode 22. Also, this Saturday at 10 p.m. Eastern, I'm going to do an interview on Instagram Live with my old friend Andy Ryder, and you can check that out by following him on Instagram at Andy Ryder again, and also follow me at Jason Farr Pics. So that's this Saturday, the 6th, at 10 p.m. Eastern. And finally, we had a new person join the fight for their itis. Barak Ziv supported our podcast and newsletter efforts, so big thanks to him. You can support too. You can go to thereitispod.com to find out support information. Okay, on with today's show. I spoke to comedian Rebecca Rush about her move from the East Coast to the West Coast, starting out in comedy, and she shared some truths about sobriety that were very interesting. It's a really thoughtful and also fun talk. So here's my chat with Rebecca Rush.
I'm actually from Connecticut. That's where I started comedy. And then after like 3 years or so, I moved to New York.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay, cool. Where in Connecticut were you?
Central and the Shoreline.
Okay. I've only been to a couple of spots in Connecticut. I'm not too familiar with it, with the lay of the land. I don't have the lay of the land there, I don't guess.
First place I ever performed was Joker's Wild Comedy Club in New Haven.
Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. That's where I've been, is New Haven.
I was very drunk, and I brought a bunch of my work friends, and I heckled the comics before me because I didn't know any better. And then I got on stage and read a list of tweets.
So how did that go?
I mean, I thought it went great. It didn't go great after that for a while. Yeah, it took me like a year to even try, because I'd written a blog when I lived in Miami that was like, I knew some things were funny, and I got some like blog awards. And then I moved back. I got divorced and moved back to Connecticut. Mm-hmm. And I started gaining a Twitter following because Twitter was so small then. And everyone was really into these like joke formats, and you could just kind of jump on that. Like, my spirit animal is a nail polish, and you know what I mean? And then we had this thing called Favestar, which is like a third party app to favorite things, because Twitter didn't have a like button then. Mm-hmm. And I got involved in that, and my follower count started going up, and I kind of thought because I kind of learned how to write a joke from Twitter, and I became friends with all these people, and we were like on Twitter and Tumblr, and then I'm going to a meetup in New York with these people, some of whom I'm still friends with. I got so drunk I got kicked out of the bar, but before that happened, I met a woman who said she was a stand-up comic. She wasn't really, but for the purposes of this story, she was enough. And she was like, well, do you write jokes? And I wrote this 5-minute set and sent it to her, and she just changed everything to a dick joke. But it took me a year people would just tell me here and there, because I like to tell stories. like, oh, you should do comedy. And it took me a year. I blacked out at that event, and I was sharing a suite with a bunch of other Twitter people, and I don't remember what happened, but they walked in on me like wandering around naked, being like, "I'm not that kind of girl," but I was, and that's how I started. I was going to turn 30, and I was like, I better try comedy now because I'm 30, and that made sense to me. I was afraid I would like never do it.
Wow.
If
Yeah.
I,
So,
but because of like Twitter, I had this weird. I was so awkward on stage, but I kind of knew how to write, and I'd been a writer, so I had this weird like. I thought I was like, well, now that I turned 30, like any moment I was going to wake up and be like super old. So I had this like pressure, like I better make it really, really fast. I like just didn't understand anything. Like if I bombed, it was the crowd's fault. I mean, I performed one of my first times in New London where I lived. It's like Art Town. And it was somebody's birthday, and the crowd, like looking back, was just standing there wanting to laugh. And I was so drunk, and I was so mad when I got off stage that I took a shot and then smashed it in this cake that was like the guy's birthday cake that the party was for, who was such a nice guy. But that's kind of just, how I was at the beginning of comedy. It was not a joy. I was not a joy to be around,
and you mentioned that you were writing before that. So that was your career at that, prior to this, that was what you were doing.
Well, I worked for a website, and I'd worked briefly for a paper, and like I was doing some freelance stuff, but it wasn't like a full-time live on my own without, my ex-husband or my mom helping me kind of career. It was just something I'd always done and always wanted to do, and was just kind of afraid to really do, in like a full, complete way.
Well, you've done a ton. You've written a ton. Like you've had work in a lot of different publications. And there's one that I'm interested in because you're a regular contributor at it. It's The Fix. And is The Fix the website that's it sort of covers addiction?
Yeah, I was a regular contributor at The Fix for several years, but they lost budgeting and they weren't no longer able to pay. So I switched over to Work at Health, which is where I regularly contribute now. But it's similar. They pay better than The Fix. But The Fix was the first place I started writing for about addiction recovery and mental health.
I see. And so that's something that you have a lot of experience in, or is it something that you have sort of training in discussing?
I've been sober for over 2 years, and I've been trying to get sober for 12 years. So I have just a lot of personal experience.
Okay. Wow, that's great. Well, good on you.
Thanks.
Yeah. And so you've been writing for publications like that for quite some time?
I'd say maybe I've been freelancing steadily for like about 4 years now. And every year I'm making more off of it, and I'm writing more regularly, and I've got more coming out.
And you mentioned that when you started writing, it was because you liked it and it was something you knew you wanted to do. And so you kept doing it. With comedy, was there a different spark there, or is it kind of the same thing? Like you like doing it, so you want to keep doing it? Because I feel like in both realms, you're doing a lot. You're making a lot of ground.
Well, I've always just liked to write. It was an escape, reading and writing. And the only place I really found like I could relate to anybody was the people that I found in books. And I always wanted to give that back to the world. But I was a poet in college, and I published poetry, and that was really what I wanted to do, and was upset and confused that there was no jobs for poets really. But what I found in comedy, it was very much the same skill set as poetry, like trying to write a whole book. Like I've got a book of essays pretty much finished, and that makes sense to me. I can focus on an essay, but the whole, and I will eventually, but the idea of writing, several hundred pages, that one solid piece is just so overwhelming. But with poetry and comedy, it's like you're honing this small little chunk. And then with comedy, you can take it right out into the world and get feedback right away, you know, kind of like you can with social media. And I found that just felt really good. Like right before I started doing comedy, I started singing karaoke, and I always like to write. And then I'm like, oh, I really like fucking karaoke. And then comedy just seemed to be like that marriage of like, I'm performing and people are looking at me, but I'm saying my own words and I'm getting a reaction. And it just felt like what I was always looking for.
Oh, that's nice. Yeah. No, I think I know what you mean. It sort of reminds me of what Jon Stewart said he felt about finding comedy. He said that it felt like his like this power cord found its socket. He worded it differently, but that was basically what he was saying. Like it was the thing that gave him electricity or something, and it was like I guess a sort of dawning moment for him.
Yeah, and like at first I kept like, I was listening to all these female comics on repeat. I felt like I had to like catch up or something for starting late. And I would go to the clubs and see them. And I felt like they were like these fairy godmother moments where they would give me, I'd be like, I met Natasha Leggero and I was like, hi, great set. I keep bombing. Please, what do I do? And she was like, well, you need to figure out what's funny about you. And at first, like you spend your life, if you have the comic kind of personality, just feeling really separate and wanting to like get back at everybody else by saying what's wrong with them. But like, once you're there, you realize like you're the freak, like you're the thing that's weird, you're the thing that doesn't fit in. And so once I could start, like I was on stage once and I was trying to like make fun of my friend who was fat. Like, I mean, it was just, I listened to too much Amy Schumer and I thought like that just these horrible things that I would say that I was, you know, like maybe it had like a twist or something. So I was like, haha, it's so good. And I forgot everything I was going to say. And I just started talking about like, I was on food stamps at the time. And I was like, I think I'm like the first Jew on food stamps. And then started talking about how my sister like kept blocking me on Facebook. And it was just so honest. And like people were laughing. And it was the first time I ever felt like myself. And like my first few months, like every set I had, I'd record it and I'd like make someone listen to it that didn't want to. I'd be like, you have to listen to my set. And like nobody cared. But this was the first time, and my sets were terrible, but this was the first time ever that I felt so good after. I didn't need anybody. Like I didn't even need to listen to the set. Like it was the most pure high I'd ever experienced in life. And then, you know, and then you just keep chasing that. But once I started to make fun of myself and to look at that, like through that, you earn the right to make fun of other people. Like if I hear somebody just make fun of others and like, well, what about you? Like, I will trust you if you let me know that you know what's wrong with you, then I'm going to trust what you say is wrong with other people.
I live in LA. I'm from New York. I still have my New York therapist. And she keeps telling me that I need to get an LA therapist because that's the law or whatever. And the other day we were on FaceTime and she said, Rebecca, you need to stop getting cosmetic procedures. And I said, you're right. I do need an LA therapist. My boobs are real, but I can't move my forehead. Okay.
You
That's
know,
a really good point. But it's an extremely common thing in comedy, you know, in stand-up. People are making fun of themselves, but it's not talked about as much, you know. And I think it should be, because that is kind of when you start really getting somewhere as far as the type of material that you're creating. When you actually start saying something, it is when you are talking about yourself. What rooms did you like when you were here?
When I first got there, I just tried really hard to fit in like the Pine Box mic scene and just didn't. I just like wanted to be friends with these people so badly and I just couldn't make it happen. But I mean, I did a lot of Brooklyn stuff at first, and then I took some time off, and then I kind of got into roast battle, and I was living in Manhattan, so I was just doing a lot more work in Manhattan.
Mm-hmm. You always work the road?
Yeah, even like, I mean, in my very first years, like I would go to California and like, Mike's, whatever shows I could just kind of show up, couch surfed my way through like Twitter, and it was so insane and on unemployment. And so I would go to these places just to be like, well, I haven't done comedy here, and build up these relationships. And then I did a lot of club work at the Hartford Funny Bone in my last 2 years in New York, and then Philly and Maine and New Hampshire and California, Vegas, Arizona, Texas,
Wow.
just Florida, Louisiana. Like I would just go, and then you go and you build these relationships, or you just ask like, hey, there's always some comic from wherever you're going that lives in New York that knows Booker there.
Yeah.
So I like that. I went to Chicago a lot, performed at the Laugh Factory. I had fun there. But
what was that like, deciding to just go hit the road and try to build that base?
I mean, it worked out really well for me because like I could go and get drunk with people that didn't know I had a problem. And, I could get along. I get along with people now, which is weird. Weird for me. But, I could get along with people for that long. Mm-hmm. For the amount of time I was on the road. And so I could like maintain these relationships, whereas I was just like really lost and didn't know how to connect with people, and would kind of bring all my baggage into like my home scene, and just felt like everybody didn't like me, or it was just like all this crap in my own head that I needed to work through. Mm-hmm. That kind of prevented me from really being like a part of the scene in a deeper way, Mm-hmm. I spent a lot of time at the Grizzly Pear in my last few years because I felt like accepted there, mm-hmm. Like and it also was a 0.2 mile walk from my apartment, but I started to get like more comfortable because like the worst thing kind of happened in 2017, and after that I had to like reevaluate and rebuild everything.
Is going, I mean, obviously a lot of stand-up it's happening in bars and clubs, and being in the scene, just the culture of hanging out with the comics after a show has so much drugs and alcohol involved. As someone who is sober, is there a challenge there in being in that scene?
I mean, there certainly was, and I would use that as an excuse to like have a bad set at the Pine Box open mic, and I drink, and I hadn't drank in months, like, mm-hmm. And I just kept relapsing in New York. I'd go to like the Grizzly Pear mic on Sunday morning, and I'd see the host had a drink, and I'd go to the bartender who I had begged to never serve me, and then talk him out of what I had previously talked him into. And then there's some guy selling garbage Coke, on the street, and forget it. When I moved to LA, I kind of put stand up on the back burner, which was weird because I ended up getting like all these gigs that year, but it wasn't like I wasn't trying so hard to. And then I booked this tour where I was going to headline 2 comedy clubs for the first time, and they weren't huge clubs, and I don't know if they'll even be here anymore after this.
Right.
But I had this whole tour set up for March because I had gotten a year in December, and I was like, all right, I'm like ready to do this now. And then, the universe was like, well, maybe pivot and focus on your writing. And so that's what I've done. And I've written more articles. I've made more money writing this year than probably in the past 5 years combined. Oh, and it's still not like a ton, but it's the right direction.
That's awesome. How long have you been out there?
I've been here a little over 2 years.
Okay.
I haven't had a drink since I moved here.
Good. And that first year was the year that you had stand up on the back burner?
Yeah, pretty much. I just built my whole life around sobriety. So like, I know, like, say if I wanted to relapse and I wanted Coke, I'd still probably call a comedian that I know from roast battle, but I don't have like friends that drink and use here. You know, my friends are people that are sober, and it's so weird to me to be like, people respect me because I've done well at roast battles, or they've seen me perform, or like I have good relationships with people, but I finally like understand that they're work friends. And then when somebody does become more than that, like, cool, it's a bonus, but I'm not going into it like I don't need that from people anymore because I have my own back. And you know, paradoxically, when you don't need something from people anymore, you get it. So
yeah,
you know, I had to make it work out here. I don't have another coast to move to. People really didn't like me in New York, and not all of them, because I'm not that important. But, you know, one week I'd be like talking about being sober, and the next week I ran this mic at Precious Metals, and I got drunk and yelled at everyone because I thought they all hated me. And it's like, who cares? You go to mics where you don't like the host. Like, it's not about me, right? But it was about me in my head. And I yelled at them all, and I canceled the mic at like the opening. And I like just quit the mic, like canceled it, quit, walked off stage, and everyone's just like staring. They're thinking about what they came. Maybe I don't know, maybe that mic's walking distance to them. It's a good time for them. Like, but for me at the time, like so deep in my alcoholism, like it just was all about me and how they didn't like me. And it's just how I was.
Yeah. And that's obviously changed now, but you're not like, I guess this last year, since the first year you took a back seat to stand up, but this past year, there hasn't been as many opportunities to do stand up, I guess, since the pandemic is there.
No, I did a couple outdoor shows. I started my show in September. So I guess I didn't really wait a full year to like kind of start going deeper into comedy once I got sober. But I started a vulnerability themed show that's really, really fun, September of 2019. And then the last one was March 2nd of 2020. And then I started it on Zoom, and I ran it on Zoom until like July. And I'm going to start it back up March 2nd.
Oh, great. Yeah. So that was the next thing I was actually going to talk to you about. So this show, Vulnerability, is it kind of a roast show, or like, can you talk about that?
Yeah, totally. So it's based off the idea that like, I mean, every story I've ever told on stage was first like, oh my God, I couldn't share that. Like, could I possibly say that? And those have become my best stories, and also just the ones that feel the best, to be like, it's okay that I said that. And like, I believe that being that open and being that vulnerable empowers other people. Because like, once you say something out loud, it loses so much of its power to hurt you. And also like, it's transformative, right? Like, people laugh at stuff, we laugh at stuff together, and then it changes the muscle memory.
I have been sober for almost a year now. Thank you. It only took a few decades, but alcoholism does not run in my family, but it falls down the stairs.
So vulnerability, I ask all the comics on the show to say at least one thing during their set that makes them feel vulnerable. I had a guy like talk about trying to kill himself when he was 7, like, and you know, suicide can be funny if it's the person who is talking about it themselves. You're not like making fun of somebody else, right? And he was 7 years old. That was funny, but he'd never talked about that before. And then I'll have the audience write down things. And on Zoom, they just send them to me in the chat, things that make them feel vulnerable. I anonymously pass those out to the comics, and they'll each have a couple. And like, well, they have a lull in their set, or they'll do it whenever they want. Like, they can do whatever regular jokes they want to. I don't care how, like, what they do with it. I had somebody once like read their 7th grade journal. Like, that was super fun. And it's always exciting to see what the comics do with the directive. And they can roast that thing that's on the piece of paper that the audience member wrote down. And then the audience member gets their own jokes about their vulnerabilities, and yet they're not put on the spot that people are like, they know we're all laughing at their thing, but not at them, because nobody's like, oh, it's you, Michael. You said you hate how low your balls are. You know, it's not like that. I like that part of it too, that they because the audience members don't come to be exposed in the same way that we come to be exposed, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it still gives them a little levity around whatever they said.
And how are you enjoying doing it on Zoom? Is it something that you think translates well?
I mean, for that show specifically, it works. Some shows work, and it's just like, it's what we have, you know?
Right.
I haven't done a ton of Zoom shows, and sometimes I got heckled by this lady, Dr. Nancy, in the chat of the Zoom show, like really, really bad. And I got so mad because I was trying to work on something about how, like, I discovered I had OCD like almost 2 years into sobriety. And it was just like this weird kind of OCD where I think like I'm going to do something terrible. Like when I lived in New York, I used to think I'd throw myself in front of the train, but I just figured like everybody in New York thinks that, but actually they don't. And so like this intrusive thought OCD where I'll go through emotionally the whole thing. Like, and I'm trying to talk about how sometimes when I go on long drives, I think I'm going to throw my dog out of the car. Mm-hmm. And that's as vulnerable as I get. Right. And I don't even have really good jokes about it yet. I've just written it that afternoon. And this lady, Dr. Nancy, is just reaming me in the chat. Like, she's like, you belong in the psych ward. And it's like, bitch, I've been twice. If you just shut up and listen.
Wait, she was a doctor saying that?
I don't know if she's a real doctor because it's Zoom. You know what I mean?
Right.
She could be anyone. She doesn't have her camera on. That I allowed to get to me. Because like in person, you let a heckler piss off the whole crowd and then you come for them and you can feel that shared energy in the room. But I don't even know if people saw what she was saying in the chat. So it just looks like I'm yelling, like yelling at like an invisible person while I'm talking about my mental illness.
I'm kind of mad at this lady though.
She went on my resentment inventory for sure.
Oh gosh,
I her in the program is thankfully also a comedian, so I was like, do I owe this person an amends? Like that's how we do it in program. And she was like, no, fuck them. I'm still mad at a heckler from 30 years ago. She's like, you don't owe them an apology. They get what they get. You know, once they heckle, they get what they get.
You know, also if she's a doctor, I mean, do no harm. And she's trying to do harm with those sort of statements.
People on Zoom sometimes like will feel even more comfortable, like whether they're smoking weed, and it's like, we get it, you're super cool. Like, but it's like, can you turn off your camera or like, I don't know, maybe like let an hour go by without smoking weed?
Right.
Or they'll be like, you know, they would sit at a show and pay attention, but because they're on Zoom, they're just sitting there in the chat and they've got stuff to say. It's weird, but I think that's for the host. I think it's up to the host to control that. Like you can disable the chat, just FYI hosts. If you have somebody blowing up the chat, it's annoying and distracting, and none of us are on top of our game right now. So, you know, I was just like, we're trying to play the violin on the Titanic, you know, so maybe chat so we can try to hack that out.
You mentioned something a little while ago about making people who didn't want to watch your set or listen to your set listen to a recording of a set, which I think is a really great idea because if you're engaging someone who's like, I'm busy, I can't do this right now, but it's engaging them, then that must mean it was a pretty good joke or a pretty good set.
I mean, it's not like wouldn't be their idea. I'd be like, can you please listen to this for me?
Right. And,
you know, it's intrusive. And I wouldn't do that to anyone now.
Oh, okay. Well, I thought it was this brilliant idea of honing yourself, finding what works and what doesn't work. If you can get someone who isn't wanting to listen to something to pay attention, then you know what's working. But
you know, like now I have some friends that aren't comics but love comedy, and like, if I have something new that I've recorded, like I'll send it to them because I know they want to hear it.
Mm-hmm. I brought it up because in this Zoom age, and I don't know if you record your Zoom shows, but if you do, have you rewatched that, and has it helped like recording a set from stage used to help when we were doing shows live?
If I ever recorded a Zoom show, I would record it on my phone. Mm-hmm. I don't record my Zoom shows. I feel like that just not even though like yeah, I have friends in London and shit who like it's the middle of the night for them and they're like, are you live streaming it? Like, no, I want the audience in the fucking Zoom room. I want them, if they can manage their background noise, to be unmuted so we can hear the laughter. And I don't think that show should live anywhere because that way it keeps it closer to live comedy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Because when we do shows in back rooms of bars, it's just it's for the people who are there. Not everyone gets to see that.
It is so the worst when you go to do a Zoom show and the host is like, you have the lineup and you're last, and the host is like, the show's about to start, where are you? And it's like, oh no, like I didn't sign up to be here for 2 hours. Like the whole audience is watching live stream. I don't see any on now me as a comedian have to laugh or engage. Like now I have a separate job that I didn't sign up for.
Right.
Like it should be up to me if I want to watch other comedians or not. Mm-hmm. And like that feeling like it's just only you and the other comedians in the Zoom room is like, you feel like you're at a booked open mic that you didn't sign up for, you know? And it just feels like this pressure, like when you do a bar show where there's nobody but the comics there and now you have to fucking stay or else you're an asshole. I just don't like that kind of pressure.
I totally get that.
I get like instantly resentful. I was like, oh, okay, I see. Like my job, now I have this job that I'm, have to do. And like.
Also, comics are the worst audience. I mean, when I'm at a set, if I'm at a room doing a set, comics are just looking at their own notes and trying to figure out what they're going to do. They're not really paying attention. I don't know why they would pay more attention now on Zoom.
They do because their face is like being recorded, like their face is being live streamed. So they're just sitting there all like politely like, her, and we're like,
wow. They can turn off the video.
Sometimes people will turn off their video. Like I'll turn off my video and then I feel fucked up about it.
I don't think
I feel all it's really complicated. I'm resentful, and then I feel like I'm not doing a good enough job, and then I feel like I'm looking at these other comics and they seem to not have the same issues that I do about it, and they're all being polite, and I'm like, you know what? I just feel like it's wrong to give people false feedback. Then I also feel like I'm supposed to laugh, and then I'm like, why aren't these people funny? Or sometimes I'm like, thank fucking God this person's funny, but also I'm sitting at a chair at my fucking computer, like, and then the worst thing is like before, like I could be like, oh, I got to get to another show. But now it's like, they know, like I'm here. Like I got to get to another season of Dexter. Like I can't sit still.
Right.
And, I used to smoke cigarettes so I could like go out. I'm going to go smoke. And now I vape. I do it everywhere. I do it on planes. Like I can't, it's not I can't escape with it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. It's harder to have the exact same culture in live settings.
Oh, but I did go do a weekend in Arizona, a feature weekend at, House of Comedy. Mm-hmm. And I did it right after I had COVID. So I had COVID in May. I did. I had COVID in May. I think it's from getting fucking illegal eyelashes in the Valley, because I deserve that. And and then my friend got it too. We were like, we don't live together, but neither of us had roommates. So we're like, we'll just hang out. And if we get it, we'll be okay, hopefully. And we just hung out with each other. And then I got my lashes done and then we got sick. So we're like, I think that's probably how that happened. Mm-hmm. And it was when we were like totally shut down. I went to see this lady. She did a terrible job and then she canceled the next appointment. And I was like, oh, because you're sick, right? Because you're sick. But I was in the antibody period, but I still felt nobody was there to see me. They were just there to see the headliner, right? They're not there to see the feature. But I felt fucked up being part of what could potentially be a spreading event. People in it. And I went to Arizona, and they're not even. I went into gas station. The gas station clerk is not even wearing a mask. There's no glass partition or plastic partition. Like, there's no gloves. Like, and this is in August, and they didn't even start wearing masks there until like the fall, like at all. Like, it just was very much like, ain't no laws when you're drinking claws, Arizona. Like, fake QAnon country. The pandemic isn't real. Blah blah blah. And these people would just give the wait staff such a hard time. They would take their mask off. The second they had a drink in front of them, they were allowed to take their mask off.
Yeah.
So they're not putting the mask, and then they don't bother putting it back on when they leave. And, the only nights they really seemed socially distanced was when the crowd wasn't very full. But like on Saturday night, it looked pretty full. And then like Rob Schneider showed up and got on stage and complained about COVID and how he doesn't want to wear his mask over his nose. And they were just like, oh my God, he's been on the movies.
Oh, wow.
And it was just
Yeah, I saw that.
The general manager quit in the middle of the weekend and like left with it was such a fuck show. I mean, I love that. I did miss like how bad it was. Just something so comforting about being in a poorly run comedy club for a weekend and just watching, like the general manager's the cook right now, and then he walks out in the middle of the early show on Saturday night, and there's like this mayhem going on. Now the waitress is the cook, and everything is completely insane. And I did enjoy that, but then I felt like, just watching, like all of a sudden, like I'd be talking on stage and I would just be like really hyper aware of like, I'm like, oh, look at my spit fly. Like there, wow, it went like 12 feet. Yeah. And you never notice that unless you're watching comedy and you're like, damn, sometimes you can see it in the lights. But when we do comedy, spit really, that shit really, these tiny little droplets just the
stuff we're noticing now and thinking about, because if I'm watching a movie or a TV show and there's people in tight spaces and they're hugging or they're talking nose to nose, and I'm just like, what do they do? Oh, right. This was from 2007.
But this is not 2007,
right,
that
now it's not. Yeah. And now, so yeah, I mean, we're just really hyper focused on what all's going on. And I do think there has to be a way to safely have shows and do have there be restaurants that are open, but so many people are just not trying at all to be safe that it makes it hard to safely do anything. I mean, if you have a restaurant that's open, if everyone were only putting their mask down or taking their mask off when they're taking a sip or a bite, and then otherwise they're putting the mask back on, yeah, maybe that would be safe. But people are saying like, this restaurant's open, I'm just not going to wear a mask for an hour and a half while I'm sitting inside within 3 feet of somebody in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, we fucked it up and we can't undo it now. Like other countries are fine because we could have just had a real lockdown and we couldn't fucking wear a piece of cloth to save other people's lives. And now we're just in this situation, which no other country is in as bad a situation as we are, because we did it to ourselves, because we're so individualistic here. And I don't know, like everything will one day come back, but I don't know. It's cold out. Outdoor shows, I think, like that's cool. But even then, it's just, what I'm seeing people do that I think is the most healthy response is to focus on what they can do. We're all artists, right? So, I mean, this girlfriend I know, she's like finding out what colors she likes, and she's making miniature things and painting, and people are like writing poetry, or, I have a friend who's a national headliner. He's like, I'm writing fucking plays, not even screenplays, just plays, stage plays.
Oh, wow.
And I have been letting events will come into my life and I'll be like, oh, I normally would write about that. And maybe I'll talk about it a whole bunch. And then my sponsor, who's also a comic, was like, well, I'm just writing those things down. So I have a few Zoom shows coming up, and I feel like every Zoom show now is like, well, I might as well try something brand new. And so I need to set aside to do a lot. I used to do a lot of my writing kind of like sitting, waiting to go up. And that's not really a thing anymore. So I have to like, and then not always, but I would take time so rarely to just sit down and write comedy, and it would make such a huge impact, such a huge positive impact to my work. So I'd be like, well, let's not do that again for months. But I have some ideas that I'm like, why don't we just do that? Just write out those ideas and then try them. I feel like at this point, like I don't care. Like I'm not worried. Like I'm more worried about, like, I can't just keep doing. I went to Colorado too and did some shows in October, and I headlined, and I was doing fine. It was like an hour outside of Denver. So it was like a really like young but conservative, like they all got married and had kids, super young crowd. Mm-hmm. And I was just shocking them because I've changed so much in the last 2 years. And the first year I was like getting sober and I wrote some new stuff. But then this last year, like wrote some COVID we were all still kind of writing last spring, I feel like. And now I just haven't been regularly performing and haven't been regularly writing new jokes. And I'm like listening to myself tell all these like crazy stories of a person I no longer am. And I was like, holy fuck, like it just really messed me up. Mm-hmm. Like it's like the set was going fine, but it didn't feel authentic anymore. So I know it's time to like write about who that I am now. It almost felt like I was sharing in a 12-step meeting and I forgot to talk about getting sober, like where I just talked about what it was like and not what happened and what it's like now.
Yeah.
So that's weird. I was offered to do an album like before the pandemic, and I almost wish I had now, because then I could have just burnt all that material.
Right. Yeah.
Like, it's like, but then once I start adding in like some new stuff that balances it, it's not like, oh, I don't want to do any of that material. It's that I don't feel like I'm telling a complete story when I'm only doing that old stuff about what it used to be like, you know? And all of a sudden that stuff becomes part of a complete story once I have stuff about, because I'm still a strange, neurotic person, just because it's not involving like drugs and alcohol and sex with inappropriate people doesn't mean that I'm like a Buddha on a mountain. You know, I'm still weird. And now I know so much more different weird stuff about me. And I'm willing to admit more weird, different stuff, like how sometimes I get afraid I'm going to throw my dog out of the car.
Yeah. That's the OCD.
Yeah. I didn't even know it was OCD, but
I didn't know that fell under that category either.
I learned it in a book I read this year, and I was like, holy shit, like that makes a lot of sense. But that's why it's so weird to me when like John Mulaney went to rehab and people are like, I wish him a speedy recovery. Like that's not, he didn't break a bone. Like he has a progressive and fatal disease. Like it's not, speedy is not authentic recovery. Like it took me 2 years to figure out I had a form of OCD. Like the recovery should be slow.
Yeah, it should be an appropriate amount of time for them to get the real help that they need. Yeah, that's a good point. Well, we have reached the end of the episode here. And I do want to mention, though, before we create something together, that you have a podcast called Comics Book Club.
Yeah, I interview mostly authors lately about books that they've written. Sometimes comics or musicians or other artists about just books that they love. But I've had Doug Stanhope on, Arden Marine, Guy Branum, Sarah Benincasa, a lot of comics who are authors. That's my target demo for a guest. And I have a co-host now. Her name's Molly Sanchez, and we are having fun with it. We put out 2 episodes a month. It's on iTunes, Spotify, and Libsyn.
Awesome. And people can check that out in those areas. Well, let's create something together. And I'm interested in this topic of being vulnerable in your comedy. I think it is the very common characteristic that I see in stand-up and good stand-up. But a lot of people, open micers and maybe people just starting out are obviously very afraid to get vulnerable. That's a scary thing. maybe we can talk through how somebody can get vulnerable with themselves. Is there a process that people can take for that?
Yeah. I mean, it's easy. Just like, what do I not want people to know? and let's talk about it. Like, what am I afraid? What is the definition of vulnerability? Like something that I'm afraid makes me open to being hurt, which in polite society is just judged or not approved of. So here's how you take a bit, like you have an idea, right? So I'm going to write, I haven't written it all yet, but I've been thinking about, I had a client, I do sensual massage, that was a QAnon dude. And because of that, like he was like spouting off, people are particularly obsessed with like Ellen DeGeneres drinking baby's blood, which is insane because Ellen has never been attractive. That's like, nobody cares about how old Ellen is. Ellen doesn't care. She's rich and powerful and funny. That's why people fuck Ellen. That's why people date Ellen. Like nobody's ever been like, oh, her youthful looks. Like she would not, baby's blood is not where she's spending her money.
Right.
But anyways, so I was like, oh, this guy will believe anything. So I made him take pictures for my OnlyFans because I was like, you're so hot and I just want to have these later. So I'm like, that was funny. The idea that somebody that believes in QAnon would believe in anything. And then I could go sell photos of us together on my OnlyFans. That's not super vulnerable. It is a little bit because you're like, oh, OnlyFans, oh, sex work, but not super vulnerable. Most sex working comedians will make it their whole act. And I'm like, that's not the most interesting thing about me. But from there, I'm like, well, I also have an uncle that believes in QAnon. That's more vulnerable because that's my family.
Right.
And we'll go to there. We'll talk about how he is so pro-life that he believes Joe Biden is sacrificing babies to demonic gods. And then we could talk about how my 5-year-old cousin understands that demonic gods is an oxymoron. Okay. So we'll get a little more vulnerable. And I could talk about here's where it really gets vulnerable. For about a day last spring, I got into QAnon and I had a booker sending me these videos and I was like, and my favorite YouTuber, I lost him to QAnon too. He used to be like, I'm here to expand your consciousness. And then he started being like, there's something going on with kids and, there's more going, the elites. And I was like, fuck, you're gone, Aaron. And, but I started being like, well, maybe this COVID thing is a distraction from some underground thing. And I was fully willing to believe that celebs drank baby's blood. Where they lost me was when they started to talk about Donald Trump doing something good for the country without bragging about it.
Yeah, the last thing I heard was that Donald Trump is still really the president and that it's just for the corporate world that Biden is the president. But anything good that happens, it's really Trump's doing under the radar.
He would never do anything good without bragging about it. So that's where they lost me. So that would be how I would start. I'd be like, I want to talk about QAnon. And what I'm happy to talk about is say maybe the easiest, least vulnerable part is actually, when I look at it all written out, I'm like, actually would be my uncle. But then I get a little more vulnerable in talking about sex work, but we're still laughing at this guy, and then the part, if I didn't want to get into the vulnerability, I'd be like, well, I'm never going to tell anybody that for a day I was excited about QAnon. But if I want to be funny, really funny, then I will squash my ego for my art. Okay. And that makes it, to me, now I've got a full story.
Okay. And when it comes to sharing that, obviously, everyone knows how they have a topic in their head when they hear us talking about this and they're thinking, oh, here's the thing I wouldn't want anyone to know about. But when it comes to actually getting on stage and talking about it, is that something that comes easy for you, or there's some sort of do you have to psych yourself up to get into the material? Like, what gets you actually comfortable talking about it in front of a crowd of strangers?
It really comes down to my perception of the room and my own mental state at the time. Cause like sometimes I'm in a place where I'm like, I don't care. I used to dissociate sometimes, like before I got on stage. And then I just, whatever you do, the audience does, like energetically, even if it's comics. And when I don't care, or I feel, if I'm in a room where I feel like the host or producer knows me and knows that I am funny, then I'll be funnier. And so I have to find that inside of myself. If like sometimes, and I don't know if anyone can relate to this, and it's completely arbitrarily, I'll just decide that someone doesn't think I'm funny. And that's always when I'm going to fuck up. And it's like, why am I even on their show then? Like, I've decided this producer doesn't like me. Then why the fuck am I on the show?
Why would they ask you? Yeah.
Right? Or maybe I ask them and then I feel insecure, like I don't deserve it, or I wish they had asked, whatever. I get all up in my head and I dissociate. But it's just a comfortability, and comfortability starts inside the self, but there's definitely things that help, like that's my friend. Like it doesn't matter. Once it doesn't matter if I do badly, I'm free to do better.
I love that. There it is. Thanks so much for being on the podcast, Rebecca.
Well, thank you for having me.
We were thrilled to have her. I really appreciate her willingness to be so open and honest. Big thanks to her for sharing her time and thoughts with us. You can hear her thoughts regularly on her podcast, Comics Book Club, and go to her website, RebeccaRushComedy.com. Also, check out her Vulnerability Show, a show she does the first Tuesday of the month. So tonight at 6 p.m. Pacific, follow at Vulnerability Show on Facebook to find the Zoom link for the show. Follow at Rebecca Rush 639 on Twitter and Instagram. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at There It Is Pod. Also subscribe to our Comedy Lifestyle newsletter and support us if you can. We have a Patreon and a PayPal. Go to thereitispod.com for newsletter and support info. Links in bio. Until next time, be good to each other.
The music for the theme song was created by Neil Brooks. The rap was written and performed by Nick Acevedo. The logo for There It Is was created by Jeff Prater. The There It Is podcast is produced by Jason Farr.